craft weeks. Why don't you start with kind of talking about your paper, introducing it to the group, and then Millie can jump in and offer her feedback, and then we'll open it up to the group. And again, if you have questions or comments, you can put it in the chat and I can call on you, or you can raise your hand and hopefully I'll see it. All right, so Christian, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Kathleen. So the idea of doing this paper actually came to mind since last year. So while we're reflecting about the Ebola dynamics, and also it also happens that the COVID-19 also happened this year. But then the idea was to look at what are the investments in infrastructures and towards sustainability. So it's a little bit more policy oriented. So when we look at conflict and fragile contexts, one of the significant assumptions is that states collapse, and that states have collapsed and they're unable to provide public goods. So international interveners sometimes could be strayed to think that they can supplant the activities of the state and also the local organization, as in the local community context. So then they end up providing services on and on and on again, while this happened for several years without a transition to state or local actors. So as we can see in the case of DRC, when we're speaking to some of the colleagues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the recurring thing is that a lot of services are being provided by external parties or humanitarian actors and also development partners. And then the question then is, for how long will this last, and what is the level of sustainability? So then we're trying to reflect this in the level of public health security, and seeing that what was happening in the DRC was that the Ebola response, while it's also coordinated by the local actors, but the local actors had no much capacity per se. They were just more or less like informants, while the humanitarian actors were responsive in that regard. So we thought, I thought then that, okay, it's very useful to have this argument using the state failure aspect as a theoretical framework, but also to draw it to emphasize the fact that while there is this state failure, that the effort of international organizations should be to enhance the capacity of state actors and also the community actors to be able to provide those goods, because we cannot. So looking at, there's a current trend about humanitarian development, peace and peace nexus, that the humanitarian aspects of things cannot be divorced from the core aspects of peace and security. So that is where the whole discussion around this topic lie. And then we went using the case of the 10th Ebola case in the DRC. We looked at how the security issues impacted the place, but also looked at how the donor community around there were also mad by corruption, as people kept on wanted to keep on prolonging their services. And also there's a lot of corruption in the kind of the provision of services that came on board. So I'll end it at that because you have read the paper already, but then just to conclude that some of the aspects that I'll be looking at for recommendation is to look at what, as in like what additional information is needed to make this case. I know a lot of limitations was there around getting information from the ground. We were not able to, I was not able to travel to the DRC to get information from the ground, but then we spoke to over the phone with some of the colleagues that we work with in the IRC, International Red Cross, and then they gave us some of this input and some of these dynamics, but what other information is needed? And then secondly, regarding the idea of a state failure as a theoretical framework, can this also be something different that I use? Is there another theory that I can use to explain this a little bit much better?
Great. So Milli, do you want to take over now and offer your comments?
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you, Christian, for giving me the opportunity to read this piece. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to see it published somewhere soon. I think most of my comments are kind of around restructuring it a little bit, but I think also maybe speak to some of the questions that you raised. So I see this as very, in some ways very close to ready to be published. And I really, really loved reading it. It was beautifully written as well. So Christian, as you all know, but just to refresh your memory, maybe you've been reading a lot and listening to a lot over the past sessions. So Christian uses the case study of DRC's 2019 to 2020 Ebola outbreak to establish linkages between protracted conflict and public health emergencies, and he makes the argument that public health should not be construed as the responsibility of states alone, and that other international stakeholders, governance stakeholders should empower fragile communities to prevent and mitigate public health emergencies, instead of kind of investing in siloed programs that are divorced from the broader conflict and peacebuilding architecture. So I think those arguments are really powerful and persuasive, and you make two really important theoretical interventions, I think, here that are extremely valuable and promise to make an important contribution to the literature on security governance. So the first of these that I see is that conflict and public health crisis management are inextricably linked to one another. And the second is that effective peace building requires a holistic approach, and an approach that incorporates public health, that empowers communities and governance, local kind of governance structures to respond to public health epidemics, public health crises. You talk about a maximalist consideration of human security that encompasses health security. And you talk about health as an entry point for peace dialogue and as a foundation for sustainable peace. And I think that's a really important point I'm going to return to in a moment. So I have a few big picture kind of questions and provocations, and just that I would have liked to hear more about and to know a little bit more your position on. And then I have a few more kind of concrete suggestions for revision and for clarity. And I'll send you my comments as well. I meant to do that before, but I came straight from another all-day, 2-day long panel, so I didn't yet have time. So in the big picture, like the kind of big picture question, I had the first of these was about a question about the relationship between conflict and public health responses. So I think the evidence that you leverage is pretty good. I mean, I know you just mentioned, and this was one of my later questions actually, that you weren't able to be there in person, but you've nevertheless managed to leverage a lot of important detail, I think, to support this. I would push you to go a bit further there, and I'll come back to that momentarily. But I know firsthand from colleagues who were working on the Ebola response how severely the broader kind of context of conflict and insecurity, and particularly mistrust in government and governance failure, really impeded an effective Ebola response in 2019, 2020. And I think you do kind of demonstrate this effectively, but you could do so even more strongly. So a few specific questions on this. At first, or at times in the paper, it reads as though war, and you're making the argument that war and conflict dynamics are obstructing the Ebola response. And I think that's where you really draw a lot of kind of insight from the ground. And then elsewhere in the paper, and particularly in the conclusion and in the pieces that I just summarized in my introduction, you make the point that inadequate public health responses exacerbate insecurity and conflict. And so I think what the point that you're making is that this is a kind of symbiotic relationship, that these two things are mutually reinforcing, but I think you can be much more explicit about that if that's the case. And then more intentionally leverage some of your evidence and your knowledge of the public health response and of the conflict to support each of these claims kind of separately from one another. So, you know, think about restructuring the paper to leverage evidence in support of both directions of that claim. So kind of related to that, I'm not completely sure how helpful Figure 1 is in its current presentation. I think it's great. It helped me a lot to kind of just visualize the different Ebola outbreaks and alongside the kind of trajectories of conflict. But I think you need to do more work with it about how you want to use it, because at the moment I think it actually raises more questions than maybe answers about some of the kind of causal relationships that you're positing here. So it raised questions for me about spatial and temporal variation in the Ebola response, and also about convergence, right? So most of the Ebola epidemics have occurred fairly far from respective kind of conflict epicenters. Also, to my knowledge, most have been, I'm not an expert on Ebola, so but to my knowledge, most have been resolved much more effectively, at least the recent outbreaks, than the 2019-2020 response. So it like at times it reads as if you're making an argument that the 2019-2020 outbreak was unique in the what's the word I'm looking for, the kind of obstacles and obstructions to the responses because of its proximity to the conflict. And I think you have a really nice opportunity in the paper to kind of explicitly leverage that variation and kind of use that to help set up a puzzle or a research question. But then elsewhere in the paper, it sounds a little bit like you're talking about the broader Congolese context of state failure and the kind of conflict dynamics that pervade the country as a whole, and drawing synergies and kind of complementarities and comparisons between the responses in all of these different time periods. So I'm not sure what is exactly the point you want to make with that figure, but I would urge maybe thinking a bit more about how you want to use it, because I think it could be used really effectively to do with whatever it is you're seeking to do, but that should be explicit. And then kind of relatedly, and just stop me if I'm talking too long and I can send the rest of my comments by email. Yeah, so I think you could kind of, I'll talk about stylistic things or maybe send you an email momentarily, but I think you could actually use that figure to explicitly to set up a research question, and that would be really nice way to kind of restructure and refocus the paper's contribution and to invoke a kind of research question up front, like why this response particularly was so flawed, or why we see parallels or kind of similarities across the responses despite their different proximities to conflict. Okay, so the next big picture comment is about the utility of the state failure paradigm, which you just spoke about in your opening remarks. And on the one hand, I'm kind of sympathetic to your argument certainly sympathetic to your argument about the relationship between conflict and governance failure and the kind of challenges of Ebola response. But on the other, I don't know, I mean, just thinking about the current moment and the COVID crisis, etc., it's very apparent that state failure is not always a kind of useful, or I'm not sure what it means, and I'm not entirely sure it's the most useful paradigm to make the case that you want to make, although I don't know, maybe it is, but it seems that many sub-Saharan African countries, including DR Congo, have responded much more effectively to the COVID crisis than have the US, the UK, etc. And that this kind of state failure language sets up a bit of a false dichotomy that paints Congo at one end of the spectrum, and I don't know what goes at the other end of it really anymore. So I am curious to hear your reactions to that and why you, if you're committed to that paradigm, and if so, kind of how you think it, or why you think it works for this purpose. And in fact, like we see in the US, which also, you know, we could think of as a kind of a failed governance project at the moment, but many of the same issues kind of plaguing the COVID response, you know, mistrust in government, non-compliance, etc., potential violence. We could talk about that for a long time, but I won't belabor that point. So I guess, yeah, I would potentially recommend that it's safer to stick to the ways in which the conflict or conflicts, plural, have compounded the challenges of the Ebola response in Congo, rather than necessarily set Congo up as uniquely failed in that regard, but obviously that's up to you. The last big picture comment, I think, relates to the literature and to the normative and prescriptive underpinnings of your argument. So at times it sounds like you're saying that the Ebola response, and I don't think this is what you're saying, especially in your opening remarks now, but at times, I mean, it reads as though you're saying the Ebola response would be more effective if it was kind of wrapped into the peace building project. But I think you need to be a bit careful of this takeaway, especially given the huge wealth of literature and kind of critiques of MONUSCO and the kind of conflict and security governance architecture. I'm not really sure what the normative case you're making is, and I think there's a big literature on the kind of liberal peace building and kind of critiques of state security architectures that maybe work against that argument. So I'd like to hear a bit more about that. And I would also recommend, I think, moving any particular policy or prescriptive claims or policy implications right to the end, to the conclusion, or to a discussion section, rather than having them in the opening, because if they're in the introduction, it kind of sets us up to expect evidence for something that you're then not able to provide evidence for, because it's a recommendation really, rather than an empirical claim. So that would be my comment on that. And then the very last, I've talked for too long, maybe. The very last thing I'll say, and I'll elaborate on this in my email, is just about the structure and the organization. I really think it would make a great contribution to a security studies journal. I'm not sure what journals you're targeting with it, but it's really impressive and important work. And I think it would benefit immensely from being kind of just restructured slightly around a research question that you can use that figure to help set up. And then I would also, I had some questions about methods as well, but I think you spoke a little bit to that in your remarks. So I'll send my comments by email on that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was a great piece to read. So thank you.
Milli, thank you so much for your comments and for your time. We really appreciate you logging on here today. So at this point, why don't I open it up to the group if you guys have questions or comments for Christian based on your reading of the paper, or even just the discussion that we've just had here. So Keneilwe, do you have your hand? Yeah, why don't we go Keneilwe and then Eugenie and then Tawanda. Or, yeah, I guess that's not a hand.
Thank you. I think I should just start by congratulating Christian for that paper. Actually, when Milli said it was a beautiful paper, it resonated, because I also read it and I felt it was beautifully written. So, and I also enjoyed reading it. I found it to be very informative. And I have one question which maybe might not be directly related to the paper or from the paper, which is, after reading the paper, I was wondering what it is about the DRC. I was wondering if the DRC, because of its experience handling Ebola, has, is at an advantage now with COVID-19. And the question being, and if that's the case, if he thinks indeed that the experience from handling Ebola has been useful in terms of dealing with COVID-19, why is that the case? Or in what areas do we find this advantage or this benefit in now dealing with COVID? Or if I may say, what is it that other countries can learn from the experience of the DRC dealing with COVID in terms of dealing with COVID-19? Thanks.
Do you want to take that right away, or do you want to take a few questions first? What's your preference in responding?
So for now, let me take this a little bit so that then later on you can group it together, because I also want to make a little bit comment about the things that Milli noted out. So I'll start right away by starting with Keneilwe's response that I do not really know how to answer the question, because it's a very useful one. It's still something that is evolving within the continent, that I think when the COVID-19 situation started, there was a lot of worries around, oh, what will happen to conflict-affected situations and all that, about, and the handling of the crisis. So, but then there are a whole lot of issues also around probably the experience of the past, and things have also made people very responsive to regulations, and also trying to keep those things as much as possible, and also the quick responses that were made by different communities. So those are little dimensions that I do not have data for, but are worth investigating further. But regarding the Ebola situation, I think the key, just as what Milli said in her comments, as in they are very, very useful comments around how I think the issue of conflict and public health security intersect. And I think it's something that I need to bring forth much more to show how the conflict dynamics have always, or let's say to a larger extent, created some public health emergencies within the DRC context. So the figure actually that I had there was, what will I say, a kind of an attempt to show how at each stages of conflict, whenever there is a conflict dynamics, escalation of conflict issues within the DRC, that we tend to have some kind of health emergencies within the DRC. So when you have refugee flows, you have a lot of movement of people who are scared and concentrated within a particular area, that what happens is that there are some form of health emergencies, not necessarily Ebola, but there are several other health emergencies that were on board in this regard. And then secondly, there was also the question about why I use the particular the 10th Ebola crisis in the DRC. It's also because I was reflecting from a peace and security perspective, a purely peace and security perspective. I don't have a purely public health perspective, but I was reflecting from a peace and security perspective, looking at the Sierra Leone. There's experiences that have been learned from there. There's Liberia, experiences about Ebola response, and also there's also the Guinea that also shows some experience regarding that. Then we now ask ourselves, like, to what extent has international actors been able to learn to infuse, let me use the same word I use again, institutional sustainability, like rather than saying, okay, we tackle this at this level, we tackle this right now, the Ebola crisis is here right now, and then we respond. What about a discussion about enhancing the capacity of state actors for a longer term response? Not necessarily about this Ebola public health, this Ebola crisis, but also about looking forward to the future, as in, should it only be like when there's emergencies, then international actors work with state actors to respond to this crisis, or is there some kind of enhancement of capacity that is needed to make sure that this thing doesn't occur in the future? So some of this discussion if I want to stretch it a little bit, maybe something will reflect with what Keneilwe was saying about to what extent have lessons from here impacted on on the Ebola response, impacted on the responses of the DRC? Probably there are some lessons, some more institutional-based kind of lesson, not really about the Ebola situation per se, but having to address Ebola in the long term. And then the last thing that I'll comment regarding the Milli's response was also the fact that we also need to look at it that there's the Peacebuilding Commission, which the United Nations developed recently, was 2005, and then they have some African countries as part of the first test case where this Peacebuilding Commission should work in. The idea of this Peacebuilding Commission is to recommend a wide array of areas where peace could be achieved by ensuring that there is long-term development in the state, and also there is long-term kind of responses to challenges. So trying to address that peace-building approach, that public health is also a concern for both several warring sides of a conflict. So why not bring it as part of the discussion, also bring it on the table as part of the discussion with rebel groups, so that they discuss both how to mitigate these public health emergencies that have always been recurring within the context of DRC, and then also looking forward to how they put sustainable measures to address the crisis. So that is one of the areas that I was trying to look at it from. But I really appreciate the comments. They are very, very useful. And also the theoretical framework is something I'm really battling with. I know that it's what will I say? Even when I was writing it, I said it's an easy to use concept to use to engage the discourse. But for lack of better words, I then decided, lack of better choices, I decided to use that. Thank you.
Sorry. Do you feel like you've adequately responded to Milli's comments? Shall I move on to the queue from others? Does that work for you for now?
Yeah, so it's a lot of them are comments, useful comments that I've noted down. So
okay. Yeah, don't feel like you need to respond to everything right now.
Okay. Talk after or by email, that would be fine. So
great. So let's then go back to the list we have going. We have Eugenie. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Thank you so much. I want to congratulate Christian for the nice paper, and I want to jump in immediately in what he just said at the last time concerning the concept. So the overall observation that I've noted while reading the paper is that it lacks a lot of concept definition. For example, the peace building is well noted in the text but not defined. So it is good when at the starting point of a paper it let the author know what is meaning by each word of the topic, so that the author or the reader can be familiar with what the author is doing during in the paper. So it will be very useful if he can define the main concept like peace building and what he understood by public health security before going through the paper. Then I want to go in the paper and ask him whatever is want to look at the global health security versus peace building. It is also well the peaceful context is well described, right? But the health system of the Democratic Republic of Congo is missing in the text. So it is well if he described the health system, so that it will be very easy to see that there is a failure, or there is how can I say, there is insufficient health facilities in the country that can explain why the health security, the global public health is a huge security in the country. So I was wondering why he didn't define how the health security, the health system of the DRC in general can be exposed. What about the health facilities by region? For example, when he go through the Now Kivu, where conflict is very intense since many years. It will be also helpful if you can say that in the North Kivu, for example, the health facilities compared to the rest of the country are very weak or are not existing because the conflict has destroyed all health facilities that have been existed in the city, etc. So things like that, it is helpful that you can define the health security. I also noted in the paper that the role of the private sector is missing. So the health system is not always about the public health system, right? The private sector also play a great role in the health system of the country. But while reading the paper, it has been missing how the private sector can also contribute in the global health security of the DRC. And finally, just to conclude, I was wondering, as he said last, that the inflow or the outflow of refugees from DRC is also a good challenge. So I was asking myself, why didn't he try to have the analysis between refugee versus nationals, between urban versus rural area, and even between gender, between male and women? How do the health security differ between those different groups? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Christian, do you want to take a moment to respond?
Yeah, I think I'll respond to this. Thanks so much, Eugene. You brought up a lot of useful concepts that I think on the first one, yeah, you know, when you're working around these issues on peace building, sometimes you think that you have already defined it in your head, even before while writing it, you think that it's so evident. But also, I think it was a useful thing to contextualize in the paper to show why it should be connected to that. Because peace building, in my mind, it speaks about a lot of interconnections of a whole lot of issues that need to be addressed, like all the issues that the state has needs to be addressed and brought in within this peace building approach, whether it be health, water, or whatever, then towards the hard, let's say, political issues around who governs what, all of them should be brought on the table in peace building discourses. And I think I didn't contextualize that properly. And then something again useful that you mentioned about describing the health security in the DRC, in the context, like let's say in the city, in other places, and also within the North Kivu and Ituri regions, which were like the major places that we are looking at in this case, to show what are the weaknesses of that health security and how does it impact the global security level to this global health security discussion that I'm trying to have. I think it's something that I will need to do also, which I also recognize clearly that I have to beef up within the paper to show that, okay, here is the real health security. It's not really not saying that, oh, that there's no coordinated intervention without highlighting the particular security health challenges in those contexts. I mentioned some of them gradually, a little bit about how the national actors, they were overwhelmed by the crisis, and also how the local, they relied mostly on the WHO. And then all that. And also tied into the last question, which you spoke about, that because it was mainly led by international organizations or humanitarian organizations, there was little involvement of communities in designing the Ebola health response. So even from the WHO itself and in coordination with national actors, they say that mostly they didn't consult community leaders because they just went directly into responding, and it had a huge influence on how they, how they address the crisis. So mostly some of the underlying assumption is that there's a lot of gaps within the national health sector, but that is not clearly captured in the document. I think you make a very good point that I should capture those. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Christian. So in the interest of time, why don't we take comments from Layla and Alhaji and then Martha, and then we'll kind of see where we are with things. And then see, Christian, if if you feel the need to respond, or perhaps just take comments for now. Okay. So, so Layla, if you still have your question or comment?
Thank you very much. Hi, Christian. I just want to wish you the best of my compliments on a really well-researched and written paper, especially on a theme that is very close to my heart, that is health law. So my comments are very few. They're largely doctrine-based, right? And I feel that that would really help add to strengthen, I think, the dialogue in your paper that you're making between the interplay between health security and conflict. So I think, and this is something you could tell me what you think about, discussing the Africa Union Agenda 2063, I think is very critical to be able to draw these nuances between health security in a conflict zone. Secondly, we have the General Comment 14 on the right to the highest attainable standard of health. We also have General Comment 3 on state obligations when it comes to issues to do with promoting economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, which are very, very important when you are making submissions or you are discussing matters to do with health, because these three doctrine-based legal instruments are also political documents by which a state is supposed to achieve the minimum threshold and the maximum ceiling when it comes to protecting the right to health, protecting health security in conflict zones, in fragile states, and also during the pandemic. So I think either earlier on in your introduction or where you're trying to make a theoretical move, it would be very, very good if you're to introduce these three documents that is going to help support making a very strong analysis on health security and the political instability that you're making. That's my opinion, and I look forward to your opinion as well on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. So let's now go to El Haji. You've had your hand raised. I wanted to make
Thank you very much. Congratulations to Christian. I would like to know, you have identified the multitude of international actors very well, but has the government set up a state structure officially responsible for the implementation of public action against the Ebola epidemic? Thank you.
Thanks. And Martha, do you still want to jump in here?
Two comments. So the first one maybe depends on how broad you want this to be versus how specific, but there was a couple of points when I was reading your paper. So for example, on page 13, where you talked about how many people were dissatisfied that sort of what they considered to be their biggest health concerns weren't actually sort of being addressed in the course of this epidemic. And it reminded me of some of the things I've read on the polio eradication campaigns in northern Nigeria, where people have the exact same complaint, right? They don't want to vaccinate their kids about, you know, this illness that, you know, of course it happens, but, you know, they want the government to pay attention to, you know, that their kids have diarrhea, they don't have clean water, their clinics don't have medicine, etc. So I wondered if at certain points it could be helpful here, and again, I could see where you would actually want to avoid this, but at a few points I wondered if it could be helpful to sort of pull in or cue at least that much of what you're talking about, there's broader reverberations of these same themes and issues in other sort of health contexts that in some ways indict the international community even more, right? Like these are known issues that they've had to resolve elsewhere. And so why is it so difficult in these contexts to sort of, you know, resolve these? I have some scans of a couple parts of some of these books, if you like them, that I've assigned students in the past, but obviously I understand if this doesn't fit in your vision for the paper. And on the flip side though, I also wondered, are there cases where some of these issues, even if in a very different disease, context of a very different disease, have been successfully resolved? Because this could also be really helpful in sort of thinking through potential solutions or sort of things the international sort of community could do. And this, I guess, sort of leads to my second point, which is, and really echoes what Milli said, that, you know, I really think pulling the lessons out really clearly at the end would be really helpful. And here I think sort of being able to say, you know, there are situations in which maybe parts of these issues have been resolved successfully, and you know, that can be really generative of ideas and sort of really more specific positive suggestions that can be a nice counterweight to sort of like critiquing at times. And I think that maybe could be nice here. More broadly on this point, and again, I apologize if this is too repetitive, there's a couple points where I felt like the timeline and the diagnosis got really mixed up. And there might be a reason to keep it that way, but I wondered if you'd want to have like a really clear timeline of the outbreak that's just sort of like a factual case study, and then pull out your diagnosis more separately. And that might allow you to sort of think through, and by like subsections, like what are long-term causes, and then what are like shorter term factors, because those also are going to shape policy recommendations, or sort of how you're going to sort of frame the paper at the end, because some of these things are much harder for, you know, the international community to address in the short term than others. That doesn't mean, I mean, I think you should still address all of them, but I think maybe by sort of distinguishing between those, you might be able to sort of gain a bit more leverage on, listen, of course, this is a really complex situation. It's not easy to fix all these things, but, you know, some of these, they should have seen coming, and some of these they could do X and Y in the short term. I don't know if that's helpful. That might be a bit too schematic, but it might be one way to sort of think about pulling apart some of your different lessons.
Great. Does anyone else want to jump in here? Have a comment or question? Okay, so Christian, I'll just, we'll go to Wanda. Do you want to make a comment?
It's just a comment. Thank you so much, Christian, for the paper. I mean, given the argument you are making, I'm just curious to know, because from my experience, I think within the African continent, states or governments are more reluctant to receive international aid from funders or NGOs because of what they want to protect, like their global or sovereign political power. That whole question of sovereign political power, how does it feature into the argument that you are trying to make? Secondly, I think the question I also had was, what is the peculiarity of the DRC Congo in as far as your argument is concerned? How Congo is peculiar as compared to other countries within the African continent? You mentioned the issue of Sierra Leone, I think Liberia, South Sudan, and many other countries which have experienced Ebola before. What makes the case of DR Congo to become peculiar compared to other cases that we have mentioned earlier on? Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'll jump in here briefly. So again, as Milli and others have mentioned, I think this is a really important topic, right? So you definitely, and it's very timely. So I think like now is like a very ideal moment to try to push this paper out. So my questions and comments relate more to organization of your ideas in the paper. And so I'll send you these as well. So I had a little bit of trouble figuring out what your research question and argument are. And so you kind of refer to them in a broader general sort of way, but I would suggest sharpening your argument, your research question, and then your argument in the abstract, in the intro, right? And then ensure that you're answering that question using the kind of your paper to go back to that question. The way I read it is that really pages like, I think it's 3 or 4 through, and not until page 10, I'd say like a lot of that can be significantly, I don't want to say deleted, but you don't need all of that, right? I think you do a lot of kind of hedging or responding to potential questions that you don't need to do, like a lot of background. So I'd say try to condense or shorten the background of the case so that you can really get to, if I understand it correctly, your question about how is it that being a kind of a country in protracted conflict shapes the ability of the state to respond to a public health crisis, right? So there you start around page 10, you start to get at these really interesting kind of mechanisms, if you will, about what it is about being a conflict, you know, a country in conflict or war and public health response. So I would want you, or what I'd like to see as a reader is like a lot more discussion about the role of trust or mistrust, the role of rumors and conspiracy. I thought that was really interesting. So if your question is like, what should I cut and what should I expand on? Like, that's where I think you're really starting to answer this question of the connection between being a state, right, in conflict. And what that means is you have all these international actors, and the international actors are working to undermine both kind of trust in them, in their own agencies, but also trust in the state. So kind of going through and being a little more precise in that analysis. And I think, I mean, that's my own reading of it. That's what I was thought was really interesting and important to pull out in terms of thinking about this connection between state, conflict, fragility, and public health responses. To your question about, and then I'll get back to the queue, your question about, you know, whether you need to be referencing the state failure literature, I'd say like, no, you don't, right? It's a problematic literature. I think we don't really know what we mean when we say state failure. It's imprecise. It doesn't really allow for a lot of subnational variation in your analysis. So certainly reference it in passing, but I would recommend that you don't need to lean or kind of prop your entire paper up with that state failure literature. I don't think it's doing a lot for you. And I also think there's this tendency to conflate state failure with being being in the midst of violent conflict. So being able to separate out violence from kind of state failure and kind of your outcome of interest being kind of the response of the Ebola epidemic. Again, you know, that's just my own reading, so take what you will. And then so maybe in terms of what literatures you lean on, they're more specific to the arguments you're trying to pull out. So look at literature that looks at kind of trust in the state, for example. Or there's a really interesting literature that looks at kind of rumor and misinformation and how that happens, or literature on humanitarian intervention, right? So I'll leave it there for now. We have 10 minutes? Yeah, I don't see, does anyone have any comments?
Can I just quickly echo this point on trust? Because my impression from some of the things I read about the West Africa Ebola outbreak was that this became like a really clear role in sort of why people didn't listen to messaging, and sort of getting people to sort of have hear messaging about Ebola like through people they trusted became, as far as like what I've read, became very important. And so I think this might be another place for sort of thinking about sort of perils. And I think you allude to this briefly, but I think you could sort of maybe do more to sort of pull out some of the things Kathleen's talking about by sort of saying, you know, we know in other contexts that trust is, you know, quite recently, right, that trust has been really critical. And the international community just had to like, just learned that lesson. I mean, once again, right, like they should have just learned that lesson. So I think that could be another place where you could sort of pull on sort of other cases to sort of bolster your claim.
Millie, did you want to jump in?
A two-finger on that, because I think it's also a really nice place where you can bring the conflict, you know, those two arguments that you're making about the fact that a poor health response undermines security vis-a-vis the conflict, but also that the conflict exacerbates the kind of poor public health response. That's really clearly borne out in the trust, the kind of issues of trust in the recent Ebola outbreak and in Ituri. And I mean, there's so much you can draw on, like very rich empirical kind of evidence from that, just from reading some of the materials online, but also, I mean, certainly I would urge you to continue talking to people who were on the ground doing public health response at that time. I know people who are in the US who would, I'm sure, happily talk to you on Skype or have a conversation with you about that, because I think the ways in which that fed back into the mistrust of the Ebola response, and people in Ituri thought that the government was seeding Ebola there to kill them in the context of the elections and to stop them from voting, and all of that like wrapped up really intricately with the ways in which the kind of conflict fissures were playing out. And I think, and the state's role in those conflict dynamics. And so I think that would be a really rich source of evidence for you, and to especially kind of dig into this issue of trust and its relationship to the conflict. So I would second that for sure.
Thanks. And to then just jump off of what other people have been saying, Christian, is it possible for you, and perhaps you do this and I missed it in the paper, but real kind of leverage case comparisons a bit more? And this is kind of what Eugenie's was getting at as well, is, so Martha's suggesting comparing it to like northern Nigeria, but even if you can compare sub-regions within DRC, right? So you have the Ituri region, which has experienced protracted conflict. We would expect trust to be lower there. Can you find kind of a similar region where there hasn't been as much conflict, but there is Ebola, but there's a better response, right? So kind of trying to find, to leverage case comparisons between, to really kind of have a little more leverage over the role of conflict and its effect on trust, and hence, and its potential effect on public health response. But again, you don't have to do that sub-regionally. You could also look to other countries and do kind of a country comparison. But I do think some sort of more explicit case comparison would be effective. Yeah. Milli, did you have a two-finger?
The two-finger on that as well. Sorry, I'll shut up soon. But I just, with regard to the figure, I really think you can even. So I think there are two options. I really like this idea of a comparison, but I think if you don't feel like you have the data, and data is quite hard to come by in the Ituri region because it was very hard to get in and out, at least at the beginning. So if you don't feel like you have the evidence to support a comparison that kind of in that particular outbreak, I think just using the other recent Ebola epidemic that was far from Ituri, even to set up the question. So just to set up a puzzle, like why, because that was resolved very quickly. Like why was this response so much more effective than the 2019 to 2020 protracted Ebola crisis? And then you can really just use that. You can still generate most of your evidence from the 2019-2020, but just use that comparison implicitly almost or explicitly, I guess, to set up the puzzle, and it then provides you a kind of entry point to really make the claims that you're advancing in the paper.
Yep.
That's great. Thank you, Milli, and everyone else. So we have about 5 minutes. So one more time, I'll ask any final comments, questions for Christian. So Christian, do you want the floor? Do you want to kind of just take these last few minutes to ask any questions back or make any final comments?
Yeah, so I think a lot came in, and it's very interesting that I got more directions. And also the case comparison, I said it very lightly at some point that the crises in other regions were resolved easily, but the crisis of the 10th Ebola crisis lingered on. I didn't emphasize the security underpinning of this aspect. And also to Tawanda, I think why I actually chose the DRC case is that it has been the longest context where there is peacekeeping. Since 1960, peacekeeping, international actors in the region responding to a crisis, but there has not been, let's say, coordinated action in good faith by several partners to actually address the crisis because of a lot of security, a lot of interest in the region. So that has also in some ways affected how the health security is played out, particularly in the Eastern DRC. And so that is one of the reasons why I decided to see if I could use that as a peace building case where there's been some failure in that particular health security regard. And then I think a lot came out around the issue of trust in the state, which is very vital to actually explore more, to engage with, but also the trust in, just as you also highlighted, the trust in how international intervention also undermine the trust in the state. So the more the international interventions, the more they feel, okay, so the state cannot do anything actually. And then the state is also not doing anything. And the discussion is just as what Martha was saying, how do I then talk about the short-term and the long-term goals? How do we now describe them in the paper? What should be the short-term and what should be the long-term goals that come in this regard? So I think a lot, the last thing I'll tell to Leila is to please assist me with some of the documents regarding the laws. Those will be very helpful. I have the AU Agenda 2063. Sometimes I don't like to reference it because it's so much political statement. It's an ideal world, but then I think the treaties will be very good to look at.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. So I think we have a few minutes remaining, 2 minutes, before we move on to the next session. And I imagine a lot of people will, Christian, they'll email you their comments. So perhaps we can take a 2-minute break and come back around, I don't know, 11:01 or something. And so I think, Natalie, are you facilitating the next session? Okay, so I'll kind of hand it over to you now. All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Millie, again, for your comments.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.